What do you think about carnivore as a diet?
Speaking of extremes that hate you, so I will give a devil's advocate argument for it, that any diet that is going to get people to eat less processed foods and more filling, satiating foods is going to be a diet that does better than the standard American diet. So I have no doubt that there are people who go on carnivore and they get healthier. The question really becomes, why did you need to do that? Could you do that and still have some dietary fiber and get the benefits of that? And so I have had carnists push back against me and say, well, dietary fiber is it's just filler. You don't even absorb it. In fact, in carnivore, I don't even poop as much because, I'm absorbing so many more nutrients and blah, 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 blah. And I always find these really like Olympic level mental gymnastics interesting, because it's not like we don't just have tons of studies in humans looking at this with actual hard human health outcomes. And what the criticism of a lot of these studies is, because one of the downsides of nutritional studies is it's hard to do multi-year randomized control trials.
Mm-hmm. You're going to lock someone in diet jail for 3 years at a time.
Yeah. I mean, I think people have this misunderstanding that there's just like this random pool of people that are test subjects for different studies that just sit there waiting patiently for the researchers to come get them, and that's their life's purpose. And it's like, no, there are people like you and me who see a flyer and go, oh, I'll try that. And, a lot of them drop out. Why? Because the more controlled you try to make it, the less likely people are to do it. I mean, a great example is people are like, why didn't they do more studies in bodybuilders? And I'm like, because they suck as test subjects. Because what happens when you're a bodybuilder who gets randomized to the low protein arm of a protein study? You're immediately dropping out, right?
Yeah.
Or if you've got a bias, if maybe you think a low carb diet's really good and you get randomized to a high carb diet, see ya. So it's hard to do these for long periods of time and keep a level of control. So we have to rely on, a lot of times, shorter term randomized controlled trials looking at markers of health that are hopefully predicting longer term health outcomes, and long-term cohort studies. Now, cohort studies are kind of an arm of epidemiology. You have your cross-sectional studies, which are, we look at this population and this population, who has a greater rate of X disease and what differences do they have? Well, those are difficult because there's a lot of confounding variables. Cohort studies are a little bit better because what you're doing is you're tracking the same people over, say, 20, 30 years. You're not doing any intervention, but you're seeing, okay, these people ate more fiber versus these people and had this outcome. Now, what I'll say is the reason I became quite convinced of the healthfulness of dietary fiber is because, are you familiar with a forest plot? So a forest plot, this became famous because James Wilkes was on Joe Rogan debating the Game Changers a long time ago and kept bringing up a forest plot because the person he was debating didn't know what it was. Essentially, if you have a meta-analysis of studies and you have a center line, which means no effect, no overall effect of treatment, and then on one side of the line, you'll have favors X treatment, other side of the line favors Y treatment, and then you plot each of the studies where they land. So if you have like this side is favors dietary fiber for decreasing cardiovascular disease, mortality, cancer, literally every study is on this side.
Positive.
Yes.
Right.
You might have some that like didn't show a significant effect or not a huge effect, but they're all on this side.
Mm-hmm.
I am not aware of any cohort study that showed fiber or fruits and vegetables did not have at least a neutral, or most of them show a very positive dose response effect on mortality, cardiovascular disease,
What's
and
dose
cancer.
response?
So meaning if they do what's called a meta-regression, so they look at the different levels of dietary fiber intakes in these cohorts, then try to compare that to their risk of mortality, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, they can basically say, for example, in one meta-analysis that was recent, I think it was with over 1 million subjects, for every 10-gram increase in dietary fiber, there was a corresponding 10% decrease in the relative risk of mortality, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. Now, before anybody goes, well, I'm just going to eat 100 grams of fiber a day and live forever, we are talking about relative risk. And it's important to point out the difference, which a lot of people don't get when they hear these things reported on the news. So when I say a 10% decrease in the risk of mortality, if we're looking at, say, and I'm just making up numbers here, but if we're looking at, say, a 60-year-old person and their risk of mortality in the next 10 years is 20%, right? It's probably not. It's probably different than that. But let's say it's 20%. A 10% relative risk reduction is an absolute reduction of 2%, because 2% is 10% of 20%. So for every 10-gram increment of increased fiber, they showed a 10% decrease in the risk of these different diseases and mortality. If there are other things that there are claims about, like, for example, people on Carnivore, it's so funny. They'll be like, why are you trying to, discourage high quality animal protein consumption? I'm like, sorry, not to sound curt, but do you know who I am? Like, have you done any background on me? My research was funded. My lab was funded by the National Dairy Council, the Egg Nutrition Center, and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. If anybody has a bias towards high quality animal protein, it's me. I'm just not crazy. And when we look at, say, a great example is red meat. So even the WHO has categorized red meat as probably carcinogenic. I don't necessarily believe it's carcinogenic based on the research that's out there. And the reason is a lot of studies don't show that it's carcinogenic. A lot of these cohort studies don't see it.
Where's the WHO getting it from?
Well, I would say the over half of them do, but some of them don't. And if you look at the confounding variables of people who are high red meat consumption, it's not like we're talking about bodybuilders eating sirloin. Most of them are getting it from processed sources of red meat. And red meat, one of the problems with these studies as well is if you are eating more of one thing, you're typically eating less of another thing. And actually, red meat intake is actually quite a good proxy for poor diet quality. So there was a really good study from, I think, Maximova in Canada, Alberta, Canada in 2020. And they looked at trying to control for diet quality. So they did basically tertile, so 3 different levels of red meat intake with 3 different levels of fruit and vegetable intake, and looking at the incidence of cancer. And what they found was that at low intakes of fruit and vegetable intake, yes, there was an association of high red meat intake with cancer. But at high levels of fruit and vegetable intake and high levels of red meat consumption, the risk of cancer was actually lower than low red meat consumption with high fruit and vegetable consumption, because people who are eating a lot of meat and a lot of fruit and vegetables, they're probably not eating a lot of low quality foods because you just don't have a bunch left in your diet for that.
So is the primary concern or the biggest risk that you're worried about from carnivore low dietary fiber?
That's one. And then a lot of them are choosing very fatty cuts of meat that are high in saturated fat. And there is a big debate amongst diet tribes about whether saturated fat is bad for you, because it raises LDL cholesterol. And there's a debate around LDL cholesterol. And I will give you the devil's advocate argument for that. And then I will give you what the research says. So in 2005, when I was in grad school, I was in the camp of LDL doesn't really matter. It's more about the ratio of HDL to LDL, the good cholesterol to bad cholesterol. And if you look at the research studies, there was a lot of kind of disagreement in the research literature. And a lot of the randomized control trials didn't really show an effect of lowering saturated fat on the risk of heart disease. But here's the problem with randomized control trials is they're very short. Heart disease is not something that develops in 2 years. It develops in 40 years. Heart disease is not the difference between you dying at age 40 and age 80. It's the difference between you dying at age 80 and age 72. And so a lot of these randomized control trials, they're using, the Minnesota coronary experiment is one that gets cited by carnivore people a lot. Paul Saladino cites it a lot. And it was and the strengths of it were it was inpatient. They were psychiatric patients, and they either fed them high polyunsaturated fats or high saturated fat diets, and looked at the differences in heart attack rates or heart disease. Now, what they don't tell you about that experiment is those people were not housed consecutively. The average duration of each of the subjects in that study, which was 2 years, and they were like, I think the average age was like mid-40s. It's not super common for people in their 40s to get heart attacks, even those who are inclined to get it. And they were in and out of these psychiatric wards. They weren't consecutively. And the polyunsaturated fat group included trans fats, which at the time now are largely out of the food supply, but back then were a big part of the food supply. So it's not really an experiment that carries a lot of weight. And again, it's only 2 years. It's hard to see differences. If you and I invest in a mutual fund, so with LDL cholesterol, you're looking at a lifetime exposure risk. Really, how much courses through your arteries over the course of your life? I like to compare it to investing. If you invest in a mutual fund that gets 8%, and I invest in one that gets 9%, if we look out in 2 years, I mean, I'll have a little bit more money, but practically you'll go, it's no difference. But if we look out in 40 years, I'm going to have a lot more money than you, right? And so heart disease is kind of the same. It takes time to really see these differences. And people on Carnivore will say, well, I feel great. You can feel great right up until you have a heart attack. Heart disease is not something you feel. Now, so looking at LDL cholesterol, what really changed my mind on it, because again, I was in that camp, was what were called the Mendelian randomization trials that started coming out around 2008, 2009. Now, Mendelian randomization is where they look at your body. People's bodies naturally have like polymorphisms on genes. So you'll have people who secrete naturally more or less LDL, but these polymorphisms don't affect other areas of metabolism. So what you have essentially is a great lifelong randomized control trial of people exposed to more LDL cholesterol versus people exposed to less LDL cholesterol. And when you look at that, the exposure to lifetime LDL cholesterol, you can basically draw a straight line through it between that and the incidence of heart disease. And if we look at a mechanistic level, LDL cholesterol, they have shown mechanistically penetrates the endothelium. It's actually not the LDL necessarily. It's the fact that it contains a protein called apolipoprotein B, which apolipoprotein D is what actually damages the endothelium and allows it to penetrate and then deposit the cholesterol there. Now, some people have said, well, it's not LDL. You don't have to worry about the large LDL. You got to worry about the small oxidized LDL. I don't know if you've ever heard this argument. It's a very popular argument. And so what is true is that small oxidized LDL can more easily penetrate the endothelium, but it deposits less total cholesterol. Large LDL does not penetrate it as easily, but it still penetrates it. But it deposits more cholesterol per LDL particle. The net effect is both are equally atherogenic. And so if it's funny, I tell people when something aligns with our personal beliefs, our level of skepticism is basically nothing. When something opposes our personal beliefs, it's like this, right? We just are so skeptical. And so I tell carnivores all the time, if red meat had the data that fiber has behind it to support it being a health food, you all would lose your freaking minds anytime anyone even suggested that it might be bad for you. But because it doesn't align with your personal belief system, you won't hear a bar of it.
In other news, this episode is brought to you by Momentous. Trust is really everything when it comes to supplements. A lot of brands may say that they're top quality, but few can actually prove it, which is why I partnered with Momentous. One of my favorite supplements from them are their sleep packs, and they contain an evidence-backed blend of ingredients, including magnesium L-threonate, apigenin, and L-theanine in research-backed dosages. So if you are struggling to get to sleep on a nighttime, if you're struggling to stay asleep throughout the night, or if you are not waking up feeling rested and revitalized in the morning, this is a great place to start. Dr. Andrew Huberman is actually the scientific advisor for Momentous, so if you've ever wondered what supplements he would create if he could, or what he actually uses himself, this is the answer. Best of all, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can buy it and try it, and if you do not like it for any reason, they will give you your money back. Head to the link in the show notes below or go to livemomentous.com/modernwisdom for up to 32% off everything site-wide. That's livemomentous.com/modernwisdom. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip, you will love the full-length 2-hour-long podcast with Layne, which is available right here.